Hello, everyone. Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started so that we can get through everything today. First off, I'm really excited that everyone was able to join us today for this presentation. This is kind of the first of our Quick Learn series. For those of you that I have not met yet, my name is Tennille Fincham, and I'm a technology instructor with KUIT. For today's session, I also have Susie Johannes with me. She is also a technology instructor with KUIT, and she's going to be helping to facilitate this presentation on pivot tables and help answer questions and collect comments and that sort of thing. So just to get started here, just some information. This is a new series that we're bringing to the campus. It's called the Quick Learn series. What we're hoping to do with this series is to really just focus on one specific topic. We'll hold these, online during the lunch hour or close to the lunch hour like we're doing today. And as the new series, we'll be choosing topics as well, but we'll be posing those questions to you as the KU community so that we can really drill down and cover the topics that are most helpful and that you do most often in your daily lives. Two things for today's session. If you have questions while we're going through the presentation, Susie will be helping to facilitate the questions. We're going to stop pretty often, so as you have questions, please just post those into the chat, and we'll answer what we can today or follow up with questions that we need to gather more information on. Also, we'll be recording today's session, so after the meeting, I'll be able to send out the link to all of you and also all of the users who RSVP'd but were unable to join us today. Just another note about the presentation, this will be presentation style, so it's not going to be hands-on like a lot of our other workshops, but I will send you the practice files, kind of what I'm looking at today, so that you are able to go back to your desks and kind of have a risk-free environment to poke around with and mess around with some of the pivot table stuff that we'll talk about today. Just a couple of other things. So we're all joining the meeting through Skype for Business, or some of you may be joining through the Link web app. Some best practices for being in the meeting together: maximize your window for the best viewing results. You'll be able to see my screen a lot clearer. Also, just so we can cut down on some of the feedback, we have a lot of people in the session today, just be sure to mute your microphone. And again, in order to pose your questions and to see what questions are currently being asked, click on that chat message icon, and that way you'll be able to see the rolling chat and pose your questions as we're going through the session. What today is going to look like, we're going to go over an overview. So we'll start at the beginning of what are pivot tables, how are they used, why would you want to use a pivot table, and then we'll talk about setting up your spreadsheets in order to use a pivot table, best practices, and I'll show you some examples of what's a pivot table, what's just a summarized list of data, and also some summary reports that can be created for these pivot tables. And then finally, we'll talk about how to create a pivot table. So I'll show you step by step of how to get that going and how to add in more features such as pivot charts and also slicers. Again, we are recording this session currently so that I can send out the link to all of those who were unable to make it, and also all of you so that you have a reference back to what we're doing today. So before we get started, I just want to take a quick gauge. Are there any questions before we jump into the content? Okay, great. So first things first, what are pivot tables? Pivot tables allow you to start to quickly summarize and also analyze large or small sets of data. These tables lie independent from your original set of data, and you can start to change them and manipulate them and really customize them as you go. And this isn't going to affect your original set of data. Once you create the pivot table, and I'll show you how to do this when we're going in and doing the examples, but you're able to refresh the table. So if you have new data entries in your original set, those will be populated into the pivot table. In short, pivot tables really allow you to create a summary report of the data that you're collecting. So whether you need to meet with managers at a meeting, or maybe you just need some summary reports of expenses or sales, that sort of thing, pivot tables are a really quick way to generate those sorts of reports. So how are they used? Again, I have here large lists of data, but even if you have a small list of data, pivot tables can be really useful. As I mentioned before, they allow you to start to dynamically change how you're summarizing the data that you're looking at. Another process of this, sometimes it's called pivoting your data, because you're starting to turn the information around and starting to view it and see it in different ways and angles so that it starts to make sense and you start to have a summary and generate meaningful reports so that people can see where they're spending money, if they're doing sales, how your research is coming out, that sort of thing. So why would you even want to use these? Oftentimes people create their own summary reports that take hours, but pivot tables, being one of the most powerful tools, can really give you those summary reports in just a few minutes as opposed to having to take hours to build these complex sets of summaries. Oftentimes, however, a lot of professionals and even people that are experienced in Excel avoid pivot tables because at first glance they can seem a bit too complicated. Hopefully, however, by the end of the hour today, you'll start to see how convenient and how easy it is to start to set up pivot tables, and then you can start to build flexible and meaningful summary reports for the data that you use every day. So I'm just going to show you, and I'm going to pop out of PowerPoint here and open Excel. I'm just going to show you just some end products here of what a pivot table report might look like. So this is my original set of data that I've been collecting. It's just a list of expenses, a list of purchases that have been made. However, once I start to do this in a pivot table, what I get is a really nice summary. So you can see on the side here, now I can start to break this down and I can see that administration spent a total of, $2,983 during this given time period of those data entries that I collected. I can break it down into financial so I can start to see by department where expenses were spent and on what days those happened. Now, certainly all pivot tables won't look like this. It depends on what information you want to collect. But for this particular report, I wanted to know the date that something was spent and then also a final sum of how much each department spent. Now, in addition to that, I can start to add in pivot charts. So here I have a chart which is a nice visual representation of what is being shown in my summary. And again, this was done in just a few minutes, pulling the data from the pivot chart that I created. And finally, and we'll talk about this as well, I've added in something called a slicer. So a slicer is a really great, it's sort of a button on your page and it allows you to dynamically change and filter this information. So I've chosen to create a slicer that will filter the departments. So as I'm going through, and you'll see this dynamically change, if I just want to see the information from administration, I can click on this administration button. And now I have a quick summary of just the administration group, of just that administration department, their grand totals, so on and so forth. And my chart has also been updated to show just the numbers, just the expense amounts that they have done and the dates for that particular department. So everything dynamically changes together, and I have a nice report that I can send out or show at a meeting. Okay, I'm going to clear this filter. So now I'm back to my entire pivot table here to include all of the departments and all of their expenses. So that's just one example, and I'm going to show you how to build this. We'll go through the step-by-step of how to get this going. Another one that I'm going to show you is, so this is maybe an example of an instructor that's collecting the grades for their students, and they have a number of exams. So you can see here they have 3 exams on a few different dates, and really what they want is a summary report to show what grade the students got in each of the exams. So I've created a pivot table here, and this just quickly summarizes each of the grades that the students got. Again, I did this in just a few minutes. I didn't have to spend a lot of hours looking through all the data and getting all of the grades populated per student. Are there any questions over the pivot table so far? Okay. So first things first, I want to talk a little bit about, we talked about the end result here and why you might want to start using pivot tables and how they may be useful for your meetings or for generating reports on a set of data. But the first thing that I want to talk about is how to set up your spreadsheet to successfully create these pivot tables. So just a couple of things to keep in mind. Not all data can be used to create a successful pivot table. So in other words, you must use raw data. Typically, raw data is something that has not already been processed or summarized in any sort of way. Also, it's typically in a list of some sort, so like what I showed you before. I have this screenshot here at the bottom, and this is an example of something that is not raw data because in fact it has already been summarized. So I already have it broken down to the departments and their total expenses per month and then their final, expenditure over these few months. So again, I'm going to come back into Excel here and just kind of talk through what is raw data and what is something that has already been summarized. So this first spreadsheet here, this is something that is considered raw data. I have a number of rows that have the expenditures per department on it, and it's just raw data. It has not been summarized. This is that screenshot that I showed you. This is something that's been summarized. There's been calculations done to figure out the totals of the expenses per month per department. So this is something that probably will not generate as good of a pivot table as our raw data that I showed you before. This is also not a pivot table. This is a summary that was done manually. So myself or a colleague had to go in and break down information by department and generate those totals manually to create this report. Moving on to our second example, this is the example of the instructor that's collecting student grades. This is an example, again, of information that has already been summarized. So there's multiple lines of information per row. And this has been summarized already to show kind of what our pivot table did in the end. But again, this is not a pivot table. This is something that, myself or a GTA or another instructor had to go through and manually type out each grade that student got on each exam. Whereas this is considered something that is raw data. So this was just entered line by line as the students took the exam and what their grade for one exam was. So this would be the type of information that you would want to create your pivot table from. Does that make sense? Is everyone tracking? Are there any questions about raw data or something that might already be summarized?
Tennille, we have one question about, or a couple questions. If we can, if the raw data can have a formula generating the results, and then how can you tell if if something is a pivot table versus something someone has summarized without a pivot table?
Those are great questions. The first one, I believe so. Can the raw data have a formula generating the results? I believe so, but let me double check and just make sure that that is still the truth, and I'll send that more information about that in the follow-up email. The second one from Rochelle, how can you tell if something is a pivot table versus something someone summarized without a pivot table? So let's take a look at one pivot table that we've already created. So here's our example one pivot table. When you click on this sort of set of data, what you get here, let me just right click. What should open up is this pivot table fields list, and so now you can start to see that this indeed is a pivot table versus just this summarized set of data, because this won't have those fields lists to the side. Does that make sense? Okay, great. All right, I'm going to share some best practices here as you start to begin to set up your spreadsheet. So the first thing that I find helpful is to sometimes start at the end. So figure out what reports you want to be available from the set of data you're working with. This is going to help you determine what columns need to be present and what information really needs to be entered into your particular set of data. So, for example, do you want to be able to break down expenses by month? If so, you'll probably need a date column. Do you want to break them down by department? If that's a yes, then you know that you need to have a column that identifies what department was making the sale or, was doing the expenditure, that sort of thing. Do you want it broken down by the contact for the department, or do you want it broken down by the payment method? These are all types of things that you'll want to ask yourself so that you can make sure you're getting those columns in place before you generate reports, because they'll be a lot easier as opposed to having to go back and enter that information. Secondly, make sure each of your column has a heading. You'll use these headings when you start to create the pivot tables, and things can get really confusing if you don't have headings for each of your columns. Finally, make sure you remove any empty columns or empty rows from your data. Empty cells are okay, but if you have empty rows and columns, that's really how Excel starts to determine the start and the end points of data, so that could start to throw off the calculations that are done within the table. Something else is to keep your data consistent. So format any numbers or dates or values, format that all the same. Also, try to use the same categories or selections for the names of departments, the names of accounts, the names of contacts, and this will really give you the most accurate reporting back on that particular data set. And finally, make sure each new entry is located in a new row. So the example we'll be doing today is a lot of expenses and going through that information. So make sure that each expense that is created or each sale that is given or each student grade, make sure each of those gets their own new row, and that'll also help you start to keep track of data and populate it in the most successful way. Any questions on that? Okay. Well, what I thought we would do now is I showed you the end result here, this example one pivot table. What I'm going to show you now is how to start creating this information. So I've already set up an original raw data list. This is an example of raw data. It is line by line the different purchases that have been made by each department. I've already considered things that I wanted to sort the information by. So I know that I want to be able to sort and filter the information in my report by the department. I also want to view the amount that was spent, and I also want to keep track of the date that was purchased. So you'll see here I've added in those columns for date purchased and department, as well as a column for the amount that was spent. Something else to think of before you create your pivot table is this data always changing? Will I always be adding new rows to this data, or is this static? This is the only information that's going in here and nothing else will be added. If this data is already changing, and if you'll be adding in new rows as you go and you want to keep track of those new purchases or expenditures, whatever, then you'll want to create this as a table. So I know that I'm going to be adding in new rows quite often to keep track of all the additional payments that happen after 6/7/2014. So the first step in creating my pivot table is to actually create a table from my existing range of data here. So I'm going to click to select cells A1 down through H20 here. This is my entire set of data. And I'm going to come up to the Home tab on the ribbon, and I'm going to format this as a table. So I'm just going to choose a quick style here. I want to confirm that the data that I've selected is the data that I want to put in my table. And I also want to make sure that my table has headers is selected, because indeed my table does have headers. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK here. So I've created my data as a table, and now I'm ready to start to add in a pivot table so that I can start to see the summary of this data. So I'm going to click somewhere within my table and then choose the Insert tab. And then I'm going to select Pivot Table from the left-hand corner here. Again, there's these dancing sort of ribbons around the data here. Actually, I'm just going to go ahead and select all of this. So I'm going to select all my data instead of just clicking in a cell, and I'm going to create a pivot table. and I'm going to say table 11. That's the, where the dancing lines are. And then the other thing that I want to point out is I'm going to create this on a new worksheet. So let's go ahead and select OK. So this is the beginning of my pivot table, and this might be where some of you have stopped or other professionals have stopped in the past thinking that this is going to be too difficult to get this to show the information that I want. So there's actually 3 parts here to the pivot table. The first one is the pivot table report. That's this area right here. That's where our report is going to lie. The second part is the pivot table fields list, and this is where you start to see where it's important that you have each of those columns identified with a header, because this is where it's pulled from. So you can see my date purchased, the department, and all the other information that I chose to collect. And finally, you have the field layout area. So this is where you start to determine what information you want to pull into the report and how you want that to be displayed. Okay, so remember when I started, I said I want to see the breakdown of the expenses by each department, and I also want to see how much they spent and the date in which they purchased that particular item. So I know those are the 3 things that I want to create. So the first thing that I'm going to do is, for the rows are the information I want to pull in. So department is an information I want to pull in. I want to see what department spent what. The second thing that I want to see is the date in which they purchased this item. So again, the date purchased is a row because that's the information that I want to pull in. As you start to add in these fields, you can see how your pivot table is taking shape, and this is exactly what I want. I want to see the administration, and then I want to see the date in which they made the purchase. Now, I'm going to pull these out of here just to show you something else here. If I was thinking of this in a different way, if I said, I want to see the date someone purchased something, and then I want to see the department. You can see here it starts to change this, and this isn't exactly what I want because I really wanted the breakdown of the department and then I wanted to see the date. A quick fix here, you can just click and drag department above date purchased, and now it sorts first by department and then shows the date. And then finally, I want to add something to the values area here. I want some sort of calculation to show what was spent. So in my case, I want to pull the amount down to values here. The first thing is, by default, this will show the sum of the amount. In my case, that's exactly what I want. I want the summation of the expenses that each department made. However, in the drop-down arrow here, there's something called value field settings. So we're going to select value field settings here, and this is where you can start to change whether you want the summation or if you want a count, an average, the maximum amount spent, that sort of thing. So you can start to identify how you want that information calculated. For our example, we're going to keep this on sum, so I'm just going to cancel out of this window here. So quickly, in a matter of minutes, I now have the summary report that shows each department, what the total amount was spent, and what date that information was purchased on. A couple of other changes you can make. If I want to show this as a currency, as a monetary value, I'm going to click on this sum amount, so the row or cell B3 here, and I'm going to right click, and here I'm going to choose value field settings. So this should look familiar, we just looked at this, but here we're going to click on number format. So this gets you access to all of those cell formatting options. I'm going to choose currency, and I'm going to leave this as a default. So I want the dollar sign in 2 decimal places, and go ahead and click OK, and OK again. So now I have the sum amount and actually showing as a currency. A couple of other things here. Since I'm using this as dates, so I'm going to switch over to, remember that example that I showed you of that summarized data that was created manually? So what I liked about this one is that it shows also the month of what the expenses are here. So I'm going to show you how, with this particular report, you can generate this information as well. Okay, so I'm going to pop back over to the pivot table that we just created. I'm going to click on a date here, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the drop down arrow next to row labels here. This is where you can start to sort and filter just as you can with other areas from within Excel. For this particular example, I'm going to choose date filters, and then I'm going to come down, I'm going to say all dates in the period, and I'm going to select June. So I just want to see the expenses that were made for June. So I've selected June, and now really quickly I have the amount, the department, and then I also have the dates if I wanted that information. So really quickly I can see what was spent in June. Now, the other really cool thing with pivot tables is we have this really great sum of the amount, this $1,990 for administration of what they spent. If I want to see exactly what is this number is comprised of, you can double click on the total and this gives you a drill down. So now I see exactly the date it was purchased, what account number this is created in, and all those other column fields that I had created. Also notice this puts it on a new sheet. So it gives you a drill down of exactly what was spent in the month of June for that administration department. And as with anything, you could rename this sheet to be relevant to the data that you're showing. Okay, I'm going to clear this filter here. And I'm going to pause really quick for any questions that may have come up while we were going through this first creation process here. Is this starting to make sense? Is everyone getting excited about pivot tables? Maybe. Okay, well, I'm going to come back over. So a couple of other things that I showed you in the example was we had, awesome. I showed you that then we also had those pivot charts that we created directly from the pivot tables, so we have a nice visual representation of the data. I'm going to show you how to start to add that in. So we have our totals for each department that was spent, during the month and what date they were on. And now I really want to create, maybe a bar chart to show that visually. So again, I'm going to click somewhere within my pivot table, come up to the Insert tab from the top, and here I'm going to choose just recommended charts. I just want to see what Excel thinks the charts are best for this. Now this happens to be what I want, this clustered column here, so that's great. But again, if I didn't find anything that I wanted, I could browse through the different templates and choose a report. Okay, so I'm going to select the clustered column, click OK. Maybe I'll make this a little bit bigger here. So again, really quickly, here is a visual representation of the data that I collected, of the summary that I collected in the pivot table. As with any chart, you can start to make modifications to this. So one thing that I generally like to do, just because it's easier for me to see visually, I like to click on the chart elements, and I like to add in the data labels, because this starts to show exactly, what that number really is for each of these columns here. And again, you can extend this out or make this as large as you want as you're going through and doing the data here. And again, if I start to filter this, so I'm going to filter this by the date again. So I'm going to click on the date somewhere within the administration or somewhere within the table. I'm going to come over to my date filters. I'm going to do the all dates in the period and then choose June. And now my chart is also dynamically changed. If you want to generate multiples of these, if you always want a June report, maybe that's the meeting that you're going to, you can actually copy this worksheet. So I'm going to say move or copy on this sheet 1. I know it's my pivot table, and now I can create a copy and have just the report of the June expenditures. Now certainly you can start to keep changing your current pivot table dynamically, or you can create multiple. I'm going to clear this filter again here. So that's adding in the pivot charts. The other thing that I added into this particular thing is I added in the slicer, right? So I added in sort of a button, if you will, for me to start to dynamically change and filter this by the department of who spent what. So I'm going to add in the slicer here. Again, I'm clicked somewhere within the pivot table. And then it's this Analyze button here. Hopefully you can see it if this is covering it. Let me unpin this here. So here's my pivot table tools. This is what you'll get when you're selected somewhere within the pivot table. And here is the Analyze button. So I'm going to click on Analyze, and from here I'm going to insert a slicer. Now remember, I said that I wanted to be able to just dynamically filter by the department, so that's the one that I know that I want to choose here. So I'm going to click Department and then click OK. And now I have the slicer added to my pivot table in which I can start to really quickly filter down this information, or if I send this report to someone, they could filter down that information, so on and so forth. Also notice that as I'm switching through the departments, not only is the pivot table, dynamically changing to reflect that, but also my pivot chart is dynamically changing to reflect that. And when I'm ready to get back to my full set of information, I can clear the filter from the slicer, and now I'm back to my full set of information. Are there any questions so far?
Tennille, we had a question about do you need to generate your pivot table? Do you first need to convert it into a table in order to get to the pivot table?
You don't have to create your data as a table to create a pivot table. But if your data, so for example, I said that my data is always changing. I'm always adding in new rows and information. Then I'm going to want to create it as a table because it will still read it as a table as opposed to reading just a specific highlighted range of cells. Does that make sense? But if your data, if your data is static, if you're not making any changes to it, then certainly you could skip the creating a table part. Great. Any other questions about anything? So I'm going to show you how that works next. I think it's kind of a good tie-in here. So I said my data set, this original raw data, this is always changing. So let's say that the administration department has another new purchase. So I'm going to insert that here. So on 6/8, the administration purchased something else. Maybe they purchased maybe just some more paper here. So I'm going to start to identify this information. And maybe they only spent, I don't know, we'll just say $100 on paper. And we'll just fill in this account information. Let's copy this stuff down. Okay. So they've made another purchase. I've added a new row. When I come back to my pivot table, that is not reflected in here yet. Instead, what I need to do is actually refresh this information. Now, since I have my original set of data in a table, this should update as I want it to. So I'm going to click somewhere within my table, click on Analyze, and then from here, I'm going to choose Refresh All. What you should see happen now is that new entry, that 6/8, that $100 that was spent from administration, that's getting added into my pivot table now, and things are starting to readjust and so on and so forth. If I had not created that as a table, this entry would not have shown up here. You can also change the raw data. So let's say I mistyped this. It really wasn't $100, it was $1,000, which seems exorbitant on paper, but maybe they were printing out some manuals for employees. Okay, so $1,000, I've updated that here. Again, in order to update that from my pivot table, I'll need to select the pivot table, select the worksheet that it's on, select a cell within that pivot table, click on Analyze, and click on Refresh All, and now that's updated to be that $1,000 that was spent instead of just $100. Can the raw data be in a different workbook? That's, let me double check on that. I'm not certain that it can be, but I'll double check on that and bring that up as a question in the follow-up email. That's a great question. Are there any questions about, setting up your data or getting stuff ready to create a pivot table? Anything like that? Do you want me to show you some additional things that you can add into pivot tables, or are minds kind of still trying to absorb what we've gone over so far? Okay. Okay, cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start to add on to our existing pivot table that we created. So right now I just have the sum amount of administration, and it's a pretty relaxed pivot table here. But maybe I also want to add in additional information. So maybe I want to see not only the amount spent, but I also maybe want to add in categories to see what, where that money was spent. Was it office supplies? Was it an annual report? And then maybe I also want to see it broken down by a percentage as well. So the first thing that I'm going to add in here is I'm going to create another value here. And here I'm going to create another value, in this case, about the amount. So I get this sum of amount 2. What I can do here, I don't really want it to display as a number, but here's where I want the percent. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on the sum of amount, and I'm going to get back to those value field settings. Here I'm just going to say percent value, something to that effect. And I'm going to choose show values as, and here, actually let's just do this percent value and click OK. And then we're going to right click and I'm going to say show values as the percent of the grand total. So now you can start to see that of the grand total that was spent for our particular, division, departments, that whatever, you can see the administration spent 24% of the grand total that we spent of the $17,612. So you can start to see what departments really spent the bulk of that and, adjust as needed. The other thing that maybe I want to add in are the categories, right? I want to see where the purchases were spent. So I'm going to add in categories to this. And what I've done is I've dragged it in between department and date purchased. So now I get a summary of how much was spent for office supplies, how much was spent for tech, and I can start to see that broken down by department. Again, I've done this in just a few minutes as opposed to having to create hours and go through all my sets of lists of data and pull out the specific values. Now this report is shown just sort of in the standard style. However, I'm clicked somewhere in the pivot table, right? We've talked a little bit about this analyze portion, but I'm going to switch over to the design tab here. And here's where you can start to determine what this looks like. So maybe it's a little bit more viewer friendly here. So here, something that you could select is show in tabular form. And now it's a little bit easier to start to read, things are broken down, not quite as integrated with one another. Here's my administration total, the office supplies total, so you can start to see the percentage of what was spent where and the breakdown of that information. Something that you can also start to add into the design portion here, sometimes some white space is valuable. So here you can select blank rows and you can start to insert blank lines so you get some white space, some visual distance between each of the different values here. And again, you can change the colors, so on and so forth. The other thing that you can do here, and really I'm going to show you on this second pivot table example that we went over earlier. So this was our example 2, and here we just have, the score for students. But let's say I want to know what their high score was or what the high score of the exams were here. So I really wanted to see what the maximum value is. And again, I'm going to click somewhere within my table. I'm going to click on the Design tab, and I'm going to choose Grand Totals. And I'm going to turn this on for both rows and columns. So what I get here by starting to add in these grand totals is I get the student's high score, but at the bottom, then I get the high score for each of the exams. So you can start to see what the high score was for each of those. And again, I'm switched back to that, expenditure report here. But if I really wanted to drill down, if I wanted to see the exact lines that comprise this financial total, you can double click on that and it drills that down exactly for you and shows you the amount, the account number, who ordered that and what and how it was paid for, that sort of information. Are there any questions over that portion? Is there anything that anyone has been so the question is, can you add the information in the pivot table but not have the additional information in the chart for example 1? So are you saying you wouldn't add that information to the original data source, you just want to add it to the pivot table? The pivot chart that we created from the pivot table? That's a really great question. Since we're actually pulling this chart from the information that was created from the pivot table, I don't believe so, but certainly you could create a chart from your original set of data, and then you could choose to display whatever fields and, create that in whatever way that you wanted to. Does that make sense? Okay. Does anyone have any pivot tables that they're working with currently that they're struggling with, or questions about anything like that? Does anyone currently use pivot tables? Some people do, some people don't. Okay. Okay, great. Has this been helpful to start to see what you can do with pivot tables, and maybe now you're interested in starting to look at how they may be beneficial to you and your department? Great. Excellent.
Danielle, I think there was a question about if participants start to use pivot tables, could they contact us if they have questions when they start to dive into it on their own?
Sure, yeah. Sometimes, these trainings are really great, but when you get back and look at your own data, it's hard to imagine how you should start to lay out information. So certainly if you have a question about, where you should put the fields or how you start to set up your original set of data, contact us and we'll either set up a desk side coaching session with you, or we can, meet via Skype and figure out what the best option may be. Susie, is there anything else that you'd like to add about pivot tables or your experiences with them or anything?
No, I mean, just that it's the tip of the iceberg, you know. It's really easy to get to this first stage and just, you know, I say really easy, but we'll send out the practice files or what we've used today so you can start to kind of experiment with it on your own. But it seems like the more we learn about pivot tables, the more there is to learn. So, there's just a lot of power there.
So I got a question from Sabrina. She says, when I'm working in a pivot table, the right-hand side disappears, where we start to select the criteria, and how do you get that back? That's an excellent question, and I'll show you here. So the right-hand side has disappeared. Now I can't get it back. If it's still not displaying when you click somewhere within the pivot table, you can actually click somewhere in the pivot table, then right-click and choose Show Field List, and now you'll get those categories back where you can start to design your pivot table. You're welcome. So as Susie said, I'm going to be sending out a follow-up message. Things I'm going to include are the practice files we went over today, so you'll be able to see an already created pivot table and mess around with some of the data in there and manipulate it sort of risk-free because this isn't ongoing data that I need to use for anything. The other thing that I'm going to include in there is recording for this session. I'll answer those couple of questions that I need to follow up with a couple of you about. And finally, I'm going to include the result of the poll that we're about to take. So as I mentioned with this Quick Learn series is we're trying to get a gauge from users across campus about what topics are interesting to them. So I'm going to pop open this poll here, and if you would, please vote on the topic that you'd like to see in a future session here, and I'll send out the winning category here. So if you will, just take a few moments to cast your vote, and I'll show you, at the end after we've closed the poll. I'll give you about a minute to cast your vote, and then I'm going to close it, and then I'll display what people are interested after. Okay, if you haven't done so already, I'm going to close the poll in about 10 seconds, so get your vote in. Yes, you just select the button. Oh, because you're using the Mac, probably, Laura. I think that you're correct in that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. And I'm going to show you the results of what that was. So it looks like everyone's interested in a lot of the topics. That's really great, but it looks like the winning topic is the tips and tricks when editing PDFs with Adobe Acrobat Pro. So we'll be getting that ready for a quick learn series as well, and we'll send that information out when we have dates and times and all of that. So again, thank you so much. I'm really excited that all of you were able to join us today for this first quick learn series on pivot tables. For the learning management question, Denise, we're working to get those in the learning management system, but until that happens, you might want to put it in manually yourself. You're welcome. All right, well, thank you all again for those of you who are still sticking around. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop the recording and close out this meeting session. So have a great rest of the day. And again, thank you for your time.